in my hand. Right. Again, good morning. Thank you for joining us. And it is really my honor and privilege to introduce the theme for today. First of all, some etiquette. I usually remind students of a similar when we teach that if there's a mobile phone that goes off, there's usually a bucket of water. That's a good motivator. But also for house rules, like we mentioned earlier, no recordings, please. Also for everyone attending, the stickers are your access cards and entry points to the venue and all the discussion. So please keep that with you. I usually don't use microphones and I talk with my hands, so bear with me. When the Dean asked me to present or to develop the theme of Beyond Interdisciplinary, I was quite taken aback because it's quite a daunting task, especially when he said who he wanted to invite. So I'm standing in the shadow of giants, so to say, but it also meant that I had to triangulate and try and understand really what this idea of interdisciplinary really means. You must understand that in any academic institution, like you are all aware, we are constantly confronted between education equal to research equal to practice. And I think that when we start interrogating these terms individually, we come up with very different answers. The problem is when we start combining them, we get another set of reality and framework that we have to deal with. When I started looking into the theme of interdisciplinarity, it was very clear that it's a very confusing positioning because of the already existing three other terms that we have in terms of multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and transdisciplinary. And that if you ask your colleagues that are working next to you to define that, it's very difficult to get a clear definition. Equally, when we start asking the questions, we get up or we encounter other realities, such as, has it worked? Is it working now? And will it remain valid in the future? Even a literature study like the one on the right, when you start triangulating all the resources that link into a specific theme, we see a plethora of links and networks that arise from that. So just a fun fact that I discovered, the Oxford Dictionary shows us that interdisciplinary has already been in use since 1930, and yet in 2025 we still have a battle to try and understand what it is and how it works. This forum is one such an occasion where we have an opportunity to really question its use and its validity. I borrowed the definition. I went back to Louise McWhinney, who was the first dean of the Faculty of Interdisciplinary Studies at UTS. And her definition of what interdisciplinarity really means is quite succinct, where interdisciplinarity is where several subdisciplines with a broader disciplinary field cooperate with no permanent change to any of them, which is quite interesting when we hear the mantra of interdisciplinary being fed to us, discussed with us, and whether we are in a classroom, a studio, a seminar, or even in a lecture, we see this mantra being advocated time and time again. So we basically have a three-folded purpose here today. The first is to question what is really the crossroads of interdisciplinarity in terms of the triumphs and the tensions. Two, what are the three axes that have evolved in this framework in terms of the expertise, the integration, and the impact. Three, the provocations that come from that in terms of trying to understand what really the future holds in terms of education, practice, and research. And here, this I think is really our mission today, to come up with some sense of collective future through this understanding of interdisciplinary design. Now, if we take a step back, we notice that for the last 10 years, interdisciplinarity has been this very consistent mantra. But it has, at the same time, caused divides. It's polarizing, which means that the double-edged sword shows itself quite clearly. For example, the promises of the silo thinking that's being shattered, and through that, thinking about methodological plurality of difference, of other methods being brought in together into the same design framework. But it also comes with discontent, as you see, where we understand the lack of longitudinal impact assessment, the identity crisis of specialist versus fragmented knowledge sets, the clashing of rationalities, for example, where you confront economic efficiency, sustainable development goals, and cultural norms. So the real answer has never really been presented at this point. So if we look at the beyond question, we come up with 3 specific axes of interrogation. First of all, the expertise, when we start looking at a T-shaped knowledge set of having a wide view versus a very specific detailed understanding through rigor in a specific domain. 2, integration. What does it mean when we talk about radical fusion and the epistemology that comes from opposed fields? We all know that design is not always sitting around a campfire and holding hands. There will be tensions. And 3, the impact beyond tokenism. What really are the metrics for planetary change? Ladies and gentlemen, let me elaborate a little bit more. At the first level, when we talk about the expertise dilemma, are we really establishing versatile innovators? Can people really think outside of the box, and in what way does that happen? And for us specifically, and what the Dean just referred to, the year 1 problem, of course, is year 1 versus post-mastery debate, where we take year 1 students and actually expose them to so much that the flip side of that is, where do they position themselves in terms of one specific discipline? So the tension obviously is morphogenetic. It emerges within the place in terms of industry, specialism, and where academia promotes adaptive generalists. Dimension 2, when we talk about integration, is the true fusion demands negotiating conflicting truths. And I think here it is where different knowledge sets have to somehow understand the differences between themselves and the other. But it's important that we understand that when we talk about case studies and how the case studies versus, for example, the very present question we all have is AI versus human intelligence, how those things are going to mitigate one another. 2, the clash when we talk about scientific rationality and empathetic inquiry. So in this sense, the integration will remain, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges within this questioning. Dimension 3 is, of course, the impact. All universities in Hong Kong has just gone through the research assessment exercise. And part of that exercise, central to that exercise, is in fact the question of impact. For beyond interdisciplinary thinking, that is equally important. Here we talk about the gap, specifically in terms of that we hypothesize that when we have these ambitions of sustainable development goals, that the validation and what the projects are lacking are in fact longitudinal tracking. That promises are being made within the grants and within the project commitments, but the real longitudinal understanding is not there yet. The solution, if we think about that in terms of co-creative metrics versus communities, here we see we need to track systemic change, not just innovation. So it needs deeper understanding and longer time frames in order to see what that does and how that works. So, to conclude, are we talking about meta-disciplines or discipline disillusion? I think this is quite important when we start positioning ourselves in this understanding and the tensions that are being raised within academic versus industry or practice. And I think here is what we can question today. First, the core versus the other. How to refrain focus while broadening the scope. What is the negotiations between what is negotiable and what is the non-negotiable in that? Then the timing, of course. What needs to be mastered first? Is it the master or the generalist question in terms of our design understanding? Hybrid rigor, and this is a lot in discussion, as you know, between the AI and HI, human intelligence, for methodological coherence, I would say. And then fourthly, the impact paradox. Can unquantifiable work solve wicked problems? Which I think is something we all are facing in one way or another. This as a package, I really hope that for us, for those of us who are participating, listening, engaging, will hopefully give us another sense of what this beyond disciplinary really can mean for us. I want to conclude with a final thought by Robert Frodman, where he says, this understanding of interdisciplinary needs a mindset more than anything else, and that it's a character rather than a methodology. And I think that's important. One thing I've really learned from the Dean is how we engage with people, how we talk to people, how we deal with people. And I think it's the same challenge here, that when we do open ourselves up to these ways of thinking about others and how that fusion occurs, it helps solve the problem, I would say, at least for the first 50%. But I also think it's about the openness to new perspectives, the willingness to admit and the inequalities of one's own point of view. And understanding that, I think we will come a long way. Today is structured in two sessions, the morning and the afternoon. And the morning session is the positioning of the critical, conceptual, and epistemological frameworks. It is set up for us to really go into the deep understanding of what interdisciplinary methodologies, processes, frameworks really mean for us in design. And the afternoon session has a more mastery, the immersion and translation of this through the practice or industry framework. Then I would like to say thank you to our speakers. First of all, Professor Anne Boddington, Dr. Atsushi Hasegawa, Dr. Edmund Lee, Professor K.P. Lee, of course, who is our Dean, Professor Don Norman, Professor Miles Pennington, Dr. Ricky Tu, Dr. Hidong Yim. I would like to thank you all for taking the time. I know everyone is extremely busy, and also for engaging with us and helping us think through the problems and seeing what comes next. In terms of the program, just to give you a little heads up for the morning, I will introduce the first two keynote speakers, after which we will have a break. Then we will have the third keynote speaker, and then we will have a panel discussion with the conclusion of the first session at 12:30. I thank you very much for your time, and with that, I would now like to introduce Professor Don Norman.